record. Awesome. Okay, thank you everybody so much for joining. My name is Emily Cutright, and I am a program strategist on our Veteran for American Ideals team at Human Rights First. And I'm here today to provide a welcome and an overview before we get started. Today, VFAI is sitting down with a couple of our veterans on our team and our immigration experts to discuss immigration-related threats to our democracy and how and why veterans are crucial in defending our democracy and building a brighter future for the country that we love. I am delighted to introduce our panel of four today, but before I do so, just very quickly, I'll give a quick introduction for VFAI for those of you who might not be super familiar with our work. So as an overview, Veterans for American Ideals, VFAI, is a coalition of thousands of veterans and allies across the country who continue their service for the United States by upholding, defending, and advocating for human rights at home and abroad. Our mission is to uphold the American ideals that we fought for, including equality and freedom and fairness through education, mobilization, and trainings of veterans. And what we've seen lately is that when our policies and actions no longer match our ideals, and when hate and extremism are normalized, our democratic processes are threatened, our global legitimacy is undermined, along with our ability to protect the world's most vulnerable. Over the years, VFAI has been instrumental in strengthening democracy within the United States, but as we've seen over the past few years, this democracy is at risk, which brings us to our conversation today. We are seeing these threats more and more, especially in relation to immigration attacks. And so today we have Pete Lucier, Chris Purdy, Christina Asencio, and Brena Vargas speaking to these threats. First, I'm happy to introduce Pete Lucier. Pete served as an infantry rifleman from 2008 to 2013, and he serves on the Veteran Advisory Council for Everytown for Gun Safety. Since August of 2021, he has worked with organizations seeking to assist the safe relocation of at-risk Afghans. Chris Purdy is the Director of Veterans for American Ideals and Outreach at Human Rights First. Prior to working with VFAI, he developed school reform programs and policy with the Superintendent of Atlanta Public Schools. And Chris served for 8 years in the Army National Guard. Christina Asencio serves as the Director of Research and Analysis of Refugee Protection at Human Rights First. Most recently, Christina was an attorney with the Florence Immigrant and Refugee Rights Project in Arizona. And prior to that, Christina spent a decade working with refugee protection in the Americas, Middle East, Southeast Asia, with UNHCR and various NGOs. And finally, we have Brena Vargas. Brena is a refugee advocacy advisor at Human Rights First, where she works to safeguard the rights of refugees and asylum seekers and ensure the United States commits to refugee protection. She implements plans to restore asylum protections, collaborates with partners to protect the asylum system, and drafts materials to support Human Rights First's advocacy. And before we get started, just always a reminder to please utilize the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen for this conversation. And if there's time in the end, we'd love to hear from the audience and hear what questions you have. But we'll go ahead and get started. And Christina, I would love to kind of pass it over to you to hopefully kind of set the scene for us. You know, what is asylum and what policies are in place for people at the border who are seeking asylum right now?
Yes. Hi, everyone. And thank you, Emily, and everyone else for joining us today to have this important discussion. So, what is asylum? Following the horrors, the destruction, and the mass displacement caused by World War II, the United States, together with other countries, led the drafting of the Refugee Convention. And that convention is an international treaty that sets out, under what circumstances could somebody be in need of asylum protection, someone who's been forced to leave their home on account of persecution, violence, targeted harm against them or their family because of certain protected characteristics, such as their religion, their political beliefs, their nationality, membership in a particular social group, among others. And so in 1980, the US Congress passed the Refugee Act, and that looked to bring into compliance with these obligations our own domestic laws. And the 1980 Refugee Act sets out and incorporates this definition of, who is a refugee and the asylum process. So under the former Trump administration, a series of measures were put in place to really begin to restrict access to asylum protection at the southwest border. And it's important to sort of look back there to understand where we are now today. So those restrictions included capping the numbers of people who could be physically processed at ports of entry, which are just the official border crossing points along the southwest border for anyone, myself or anyone who's looking to cross physically by land between both countries. So people seeking asylum presenting at these ports, there were these, numerical caps, which was called metering, which took place. Other policies such as migrant protection protocols, which was, essentially remain in Mexico, forced people seeking asylum to wait in Mexico during their asylum hearing, during the pendency of their asylum hearings. And then all of that really culminated with the pandemic. And under the pretext of public health, the former Trump administration invoked a little known clause in the U.S. Code, federal laws under Title 42, which looked to essentially block access for people seeking asylum at the border. And this was the first time really the U.S. sort of, broke from this tradition of recognizing the right to seek asylum. So for 3 years, access was restricted for people who were approaching, trying to seek asylum, and migrants and asylum seekers were summarily expelled. And so these were expulsions under Title 42 that many of you likely remember. So a year ago, just now, so, May 11th of last year, Title 42 expired, the order under Title 42 that allowed the U.S. government to sort of set these restrictions at the southwest border wrongfully. And the Biden administration implemented a new rule. And this rule is what advocates call the asylum ban, because essentially what it does is it bars access to asylum to anyone entering through the southwest border who's not a Mexican national and is looking to apply for asylum protection unless they meet a handful of really narrow exceptions. And I can go into that further.
Yeah, I'd love if you could talk a little bit more about this asylum ban, the 1-year anniversary that we're seeing, especially the policy implications of it.
Sure, Emily. So we recently published a report this week, which looks at this whole first year that the asylum ban has been in effect, and it updates prior reports we've been issuing throughout all of last year. And that's linked in materials that we can share with you all if you're interested in reading. So in effect, what this rule does is it bars access to asylum with the exception of people who have entered with an appointment. So entered at one of, designated number of these official crossing points along the border, these ports of entry, with an appointment. The appointment needs to be requested using a mobile application, like a smartphone app. And folks need to be able to register and request an appointment every single day. And it functions like a lottery-based system. So, it's not chronological entirely in terms of, when you register to when you'll receive an appointment. So there's a lot of uncertainty because it's an indefinite time period. We've documented people waiting up to 7 months to try to get an appointment through this system. And the other thing is that this mobile application is only available in 3 languages. It's available in English, Spanish, and Haitian Creole. As many of you know, there are folks, arriving at our southwest border in need of asylum protection who don't speak one of these 3 languages. For example, Afghans that I spoke with stranded in Tijuana who were struggling to try to use this mobile app, of the ones who had actually even heard of it, because many people who don't speak one of these languages haven't heard of this app, is what we found in our research. And so some folks were struggling to try to use it. And I spoke with them in Darien and Pashto with the help of a colleague who was interpreting from our team. But, they were, desperate, and just this sense of despair of not knowing when they would be able to obtain this appointment, having to struggle to use it. And so the system conditions access to asylum protection, which is a fundamental human right, on use of a smartphone app, this technology that's only accessible in 3 languages. And so people who speak indigenous languages or any other language can't access it. People who don't have smartphones, and we've identified many people who have been targeted by both, cartels, which has become really systematic at this point, the targeting of migrants by cartels, but also by Mexican authorities. And just coming back to this example of the Afghans I interviewed, just because it's really emblematic of what the experience of so many people seeking asylum is throughout their journey through Mexico. There are folks that I spoke with who were fleeing life-threatening harms, as many of you on this call are familiar with. Folks whose, for example, brothers had been in the Afghan National Army, were fleeing Taliban persecution, someone who was a US military contractor who even had an SIV application that had been pending for over a year and was at our southwest border, having undertaken the treacherous journey through the Darien to try to get there because of other failed policies. And so people are targeted and they're at risk and they're stranded in Mexico without any resources or support that they need. And they're forced to navigate this app because if they don't, and if they enter either at one of these official crossing points or if they enter between these points, such as, crossing through the desert, through the border wall, crossing the Rio Grande, putting their lives at risk essentially to do so, the US government under this rule is finding that they're not eligible for asylum, just based merely because of that and a few other exceptions that they can't meet. And then they're held to a higher standard in a fear screening interview or an immigration court when they go before a judge. And that increases the likelihood that they may be returned to persecution and to danger. In our report, we've documented cases of people who were ordered deported merely because they couldn't meet this higher standard, which is not lawful because our US Refugee Act, like I mentioned, incorporates our obligations and it sets a standard set by Congress for these initial fear screenings at the border. And this rule violates that law. And so yeah.
Christina, real quick, I just want to hit that Afghan point again. I don't think a lot of people understand, especially veterans that maybe are working in the Afghanistan space and they were part of the evacuation, they're continuing, they have case loads and stuff like that. I don't think people understand that they get to the border after this arduous journey, even though there is a kind of a relocation pipeline elsewhere, and they're still not allowed, they're still not able to get in. Is the government doing anything to help these folks, or what can be done?
Yeah, Chris, I mean, there's definitely a sense of exasperation and desperation because people are stranded. They're stranded in Mexico and, forced to contend with this mobile application. And those who cross between ports of entry, such as there are Afghans that, speaking with some who were still in Tijuana, had mentioned that, others who had been waiting alongside with them just grew so desperate because some were targeted, for example, by Mexican authorities. Some had been targeted by the Mexican National Guard even, and extorted and threatened with deportation. One of them even had a family even had a CBP-1 appointment, and Mexican immigration officials at the airport, once arriving to Tijuana and in Mexico City, extorted them and threatened to delete their appointment. And so this is a situation that Afghans and others are in. They're trapped, they're stranded, and there's no way to access asylum protection under this rule at this moment. And because of other related restrictions on access, so, additional efforts to sort of cap the people who can approach through one of these official crossing points if you don't have an appointment, it's so low that people are desperate and they're driven to seek protection, to turn themselves in to Border Patrol authorities, as many of you see on the news. And yet this rule then punishes them, unlawfully, and increases the chance that they will face the risk of return, which is unimaginable if you're thinking about our Afghan allies and others.
Yeah, I think it's really hard to grapple with the fact that, our government is perpetuating a lot of these abuses, which I know we'll get into a minute, but I did want to pass it over to Brenda because I know, Brenda, you've been to the border, you've seen kind of what this ban had, the effects that it has on the ground. I was hoping that you could tell us a little bit about the research and what you've seen.
Yeah, thank you so much, Emily. So as we just heard, people are stranded under the asylum ban. And because of this harmful policy, people are subjected to unnecessary harm. So I've joined Christina at different research trips in Matamoros, Reynosa, Ciudad Juarez, and we've interviewed families with children, members of the LGBTQ community, Black asylum seekers, and people that are in a situation that is very traumatic for them. These are people that are fleeing situations of persecution and violence. One particular individual comes to my mind. I spoke to a Venezuelan man who was kidnapped and beaten by, he wasn't sure who they were. They just had two-way radios in Reynosa. And while waiting in Mexico for a CBP-1 appointment, this man was held captive and beaten on his face and the back of his legs, and was held captive for 10 days. He also shared that he witnessed, while he was held captive, men being subjected to more harm and being beaten more if their family didn't pay any ransom. He also witnessed someone, it's very graphic, but he witnessed one of the captors cut off someone else's finger off. And these are situations that are very traumatic for folks. This is just one example of the horrors that people live through because of this asylum ban. Christina and the research team has documented and has tracked reports of 2,500 survivors of kidnapping, torture, sexual assault, and other just violent attacks against asylum seekers and migrants in Mexico while they're waiting to seek asylum since the ban first took effect. In some parts of the border, we've also documented that reports of sexual assault and violent harm are up 70%. Essentially, this policy forces people to wait in Mexico for many months. I spoke to a Honduran woman and her children that waited 9 months waiting for a CBP-1 appointment in Mexico. And she shared that she felt unsafe, that she felt discriminated against, and she was also robbed on her way to get food. Essentially, folks are waiting here for so many months. And even the State Department is designating some of these locations as level 4 do not travel. The same designation given to war zones like Iraq and Afghanistan. Even for myself and Christina, when we've gone to Matamoros and Reynosa, when we're walking around, we feel uneasy, we feel like we're being watched. And so if you can only imagine folks that are waiting here, that are forced to wait for that CBP-1 appointment, it's just a cycle of harm and trauma for them. Essentially, this policy, it's cruel, it's inhumane, and we have to ensure the safety and well-being of asylum seekers and migrants, and many who are there fleeing persecution and violence. Thank you so much, Emily.
Yeah, and I think it's really important kind of what you touched on, the felt like you're being watched. I think we've seen, especially over the past year and a half, a much more militarized southwest border, using state National Guard, sending the National Guard to block people from seeking asylum through Operation Lone Star. Pete, I think we're seeing this much more militarized response to what is a humanitarian problem, which, I think a lot of veterans feel is very disingenuous to our American ideals. And so I was just hoping that you could kind of talk to us as a veteran, how, seeing this Operation Lone Star, seeing this militarized border, how, as a veteran, how does that affect you?
Yeah. Thanks for the question. Real quick before I answer, just going back to what Brenda said and just doubling down on it too, like those 2,500, cases of these really horrific crimes against people who are waiting. What I don't know, the thing for me that was striking, as you said that too, is that these are people who, if they're asylum seekers, like we're assuming they already have faced past persecution in their countries of origin, right? Or they have a well-founded fear of it in their countries of nationality. So these, those aren't the basis for these claims. These are people who have experienced trauma in their home country, who have been persecuted by their governments or by groups in their home and gone through all of this trauma and violence. And then they come here and they're on the doorstep of, what's promised to be safety, and then they're victimized again. Like it's, I don't know, it's crazy to me to think about, right? That it's not, oh well, if it's dangerous, just stay home, do not travel. These are people who have to travel, like, or they might die or be persecuted, have family members persecuted, right? Like it's for that kind of thing, and for us to turn. So just, I don't know, it just a reminder that's the second part. The first part is already equally horrible. But the militarized border, it's deeply distressing. It's frustrating and disheartening as a veteran, and then also just experientially, like there's all kinds of practical difficulties about it. So this is a bad way to go about defending the border. but it's also wrong because it's wrong. It's not wrong because it's impractical. It's wrong because this isn't what the military should be doing. It's not well designed for it. A couple of those just kind of real quick. So like some practical purposes, things that are difficult about these kind of deployments, like we've seen with Operation Lone Star and other National Guard deployments to the border. Military training is not super well designed for this. I'm an Afghan veteran myself. We know what we're not good at, and what we're not good at is like non-offensive, non-conventional operations. We've spent 20 years trying to do COIN, which only a counterinsurgency, which only had a little bit of kind of police and security activity to it, and it didn't go well, and that's why now we're working with Afghans who are trying to get out. Right, but we weren't good at it. These really are. It requires specialized training. Folks from different offices who have these kind of things, and it's 19-year-old Lance Corporals. I think about myself as a Marine, like aren't equipped nor trained nor should be expected to conduct these kind of tasks that they're asking military folks to do. There's training differences, there's different skill sets, there's a different mindset, there's a different attitude, a combat mindset about running into a gunfight versus a humanitarian crisis. So those are all kind of practical things. On another note, I joined the Marine Corps because my brother joined the Marine Corps. He was in 2004 during the earthquake and then the subsequent tsunamis in Indonesia. He was on a boat on a MEU on a Marine Expeditionary Unit at the time. And I love this story. I'm not trying to carry water for the U.S. military. We're not like a great humanitarian organization, but the story always stuck with me. When that happened and he was on a boat near the Philippines, they pulled that boat into a harbor. The captain of the boat walked into like a hardware store. I don't think he actually took out a government credit card, but equivalently like bought a hardware store, put it on the boat, and then went to Indonesia and said, like, what do we need to build? We've got engineers, we've got guys, we've got bodies. What can we do? At our best, I think that's what the military can be. We certainly use some of that rhetoric in Afghanistan. When Mattis was testifying in front of Congress, it was all about, standing in front of the weak against like the vicious and the violent and the predatory and the malicious, right? Is that what we actually do? No, but it's what we aspire to be. It's who we want to be. So, pointing guns at women and children who have traveled very, very far, who've gone through the Darien or these other really arduous journeys, is just not who we are or who we want to be. We talk about moral injury from the war. That's a morally complex situation that you're asking a young person and putting firearms in their hands to adjudicate and then have to deal with afterwards. That's hard. So how does it affect me? I think it's bad policy from my experience. And also, I just think these aren't the right people for the job. And it should be left in other hands. Whether that's CBP or somebody else, they've also got issues. But for the National Guard to be deployed is just absolutely kind of an abhorrent, decision, and unfortunately, potentially like just a, kind of a political stunt, which makes it even more pernicious and ugly. Chris, I see you pointing. Sorry.
I'm sorry, Pete. I realized I've never talked about this. But as you were speaking, I remembered an amount of years ago. I'll say that. I was in the National Guard, and we were kind of authorized to. We were part of the Bush administration's troop surge to the border. We didn't actually end up going because the unit was actually alerted for an Afghanistan deployment, so that kind of took care of that. But I remember the mindset of the company at the time. And the mindset was very militaristic. And this was in the Bush administration, right? So totally different time than we are right now. But I remember we talked about what type of weapons are we bringing? What is our combat load? What is our force posture? And, thinking about the fact that these people are coming to the border, seeking refuge, and our military, even then, was treating this as if this was some sort of an invasion that we needed to repel using the military. Highly problematic. And, I contrast that to, when I was in Iraq later on, and I think about the people who were in my truck, my gun truck when I was in Baghdad. And it was myself, who is the son of an Irish immigrant who left during the Troubles, a country boy from Western Virginia, an Egyptian who was born in the United States but grew up in Egypt, and an Ethiopian refugee, right? That is the America that our Southwest border can help provide. It can help provide people who are coming to this country to then serve in our military and advance kind of the goals that we espouse as Americans. And to treat, I just imagine, I cannot imagine if I had to look back at a situation where I was preventing a refugee from coming. That could have been Walaline, who was my driver, right? That could have been any number of people And actually, in my company, we did have people from from Venezuela and the northern South America who did approach the southwest border and end up getting asylum then through the military. So I just wanted to reinforce what you were saying, Pete, about the mindset and the kind of the posture that that our military has.
And
Yeah,
you
it's
know,
really oh, go ahead, please. No, sorry.
oh, sorry, Pete. No, I just wanted to jump in and say, and the thing is that, I mean, there's so many layers to this, right? To what Texas National Guardsmen and other actors like Texas Department of Public Security, Safety as well, but just as to what they're doing, right? But and unlawfully blocking people from, who are already on U.S. soil, right? So folks who have crossed the Rio Grande River are on U.S. soil and are facing layers and layers of concertina wires, as many of you have seen on the news and been following, and yet they've been pushed back and they've been denied access and entry. And, thanks to really sort of terrifying, perspectives and insights from whistleblowers disclosing sort of how, internal mechanisms and orders that they've been given and what's resulted in, I mean, babies, pregnant women, nursing mothers, vulnerable asylum seekers, like, people seeking protection. Not These people aren't a threat, and yet they've been pushed back with the risk of drowning. And there have been reports of people who have drowned, consistently. That the southwest border has been named, the deadliest corridor for migrants and people seeking asylum. And it's because of these policies and restrictions, such as the asylum ban rule and related practices, that are blocking people from entering through these official safe, entry points where I have the privilege of crossing through when I'm going to Mexico and returning. And yet people seeking asylum who don't have one of these lottery-based appointments can't. So they're driven to seek safety, escaping these horrors and targeted, victimization in Mexico that we talked about. They cannot return home because of what, Pete was also emphasizing, right? The trauma they've already fled. And yet they're faced with this militarized border and these unlawful actions pushing them back, which is illegal under international law and under our obligations to asylum seekers. So yeah, these harms are just this extra element that is contrary to our values as a country as well.
Yeah. Pete, I saw you off mute. I didn't know if you had another thought.
I'll probably ramble. I don't know. Yeah, I'll suck up some people's time. You guys came to see us. No, again, so to stress again, to kind of start, like, these things are wrong because they're wrong, right? They're wrong because they're morally wrong. It's morally wrong to treat people who are, terrified and come right, like providing comfort to the stranger is a thing. It's part of who we are and who we ought to be just as humans. But again, if you're not going to be a morally decent government, like, at least be a practical one, and there's so many of those here, or a lawful one. But right, there's the issues we haven't even talked about, like constitutional issues that are raised here. That's another deal that's playing out on the ground, where CBP, where federal law enforcement officials are kind of being put in opposition to National Guardsmen who aren't on federal orders. So they're under. So you're seeing, troops under the kind of command and control of a state governor, facing off against members of the federal executive branch. Like, that's a constitutional crisis happening with people with guns. Now, it's not that bad, but we've seen those instances where the CBP have to get Supreme Court orders in order to go in and remove this razor wire to stop the horrific invasion of women with infant children who are coming across. And again, it's not just wrong because it's happening to women with infant children or Afghans, right? Because that's somebody that I know, right? It's wrong because it's wrong. It's wrong no matter who it happens to. I have a personal connection to it and feel it deeply because of that. But it doesn't matter where these folks come from, and we're certainly not pitting folks against each other. There's no way to earn that right to be able to seek safety. It's a basic fundamental human dignity to go somewhere safe where you're not going to be persecuted for who you are or what you believe or your political beliefs, or who you choose to love or your gender or any of these kind of things. These things that we agreed as the world are fundamentally worthy of protection. These are the people that we're sending guys like the ones that I used to be, right? That 19-year-old Lance Corporal with a gun to go point at and to pretend like, we have to keep 300 meters of space in case there's an IED or an RPG threat, which isn't the case. It's silly. It's a monumental waste of resources, and it's really just awful. It's a very prolonged answer to the question, but yeah, just getting heated over here.
Yeah, and I think what that last point that you're talking about, Pete, what it gets at is, the people in the military have been conditioned that over the past 20 years that everything is a threat, right? But really, when I look at what the military that I kind of like, the ideals that I think the military has is those, those guys who liberated Dachau, right? And I think of the military that provided aid to Haiti after earthquakes, and who helped evacuate volcanic islands in the South Pacific. Like our U.S. military can be such a force for good, and to see it being used in such a detrimental way to human rights, it's really appalling. And it just, these are not the ideals that we should be striving for.
I was in Gitmo in Guantanamo Bay for the Haiti quakes, and we were the Joint Operations Center that launched all those humanitarian missions, and then some other Marines who were part of a different fast platoon. Not that Gitmo was super great on a human rights record either, but we did defense line mission. We didn't deal with prisoners. But yeah, we had to. So I got to see some of that, of what the logistical power of a $780 billion a year budget can do when it's oriented towards helping people, right? And that's, I think, who we want to be, why we signed up in the first place, why put your body at risk of Taliban bombs and AK-47 fire if it's not in, hopefully, pointing towards some kind of higher ideal and not just cruelty. That's who we want to be. It's who we imagine ourselves possibly being. And it's an institution that kind of can. And so to see it perverted is, yeah, I'm just, I don't know if I need the last word or something, but yeah, just agreeing with you, Chris.
Yeah, and I think that also ties into, the fact that Operation Lone Star and this militarized border, there's another effect of that, which is this kind of narrative shift that we're seeing, with the rhetoric that we're seeing used, an invasion, a swarm of migrants, to describe legally seeking asylum seekers, who are legally coming to our border, have a right to come to our border. And I think that kind of, again, changes this narrative that, citizens are getting. And so, Chris, I kind of wanted to turn to you and how does this impact you? How does this
Yeah.
dehumanization by our own government, what does that say about who we are as a country?
So I also want to kind of define Operation Lone Star. I think some people might be familiar with, other people maybe not, but basically what's happening is the state of Texas is creating an operation using an authority called state active duty. So there are generally speaking, there are three abilities that the National Guard can be used. One of them is by the federal government, with federal money. One of them is by the state government for generally federal or state purposes. And then the other one is what's called state active duty, which is state money for state purposes. That means that for the most part, folks who are on the state active duty don't accrue any federal benefits. So like time doesn't go to the GI Bill. It doesn't go to your ability to get GI or VA healthcare towards the after you get out of service. The National Guard is in this unique situation where you can be used for a purpose and not actually get the benefits that your active duty counterparts would be getting if you were on the same type of title. So it's really important, and it's actually so bad. It's caused so many problems within the Texas National Guard, increase in suicides, increase in alcoholism, increase in various mental health incidents, traffic accidents, non-combat fatalities on the rise. It's so bad that for the first time ever, the National Guard is trying to unionize. The Texas National Guard is leading a unionization effort to try to get their workplace changes implemented to make it better. So that's what Operation Lone Star is. Pete's right; it's a constitutional crisis. And it's being used to further the end of anti-democratic extremist narratives, this idea that we are being invaded. People like Tucker Carlson have really pushed this narrative that the white American nation is being invaded by non-white countries by sending their people in. Like this is Trump at the gold escalator. They're not sending their finest people type of a language, right? Yes, there is a humanitarian crisis. That is not an invasion. An invasion is when a hostile military force violates the sovereignty of another country, right? We look at Ukraine, that is an invasion. What we are seeing is a humanitarian crisis. No one would say in World War II that the Jews who left Europe fleeing to countries were invading those countries, right? Those were people who were seeking refuge. This invasion rhetoric, the intent is to portray migrants as the enemy. It dehumanizes the enemy, or excuse me, it dehumanizes migrants. And what it does is it's a powerful tool in a campaign cycle when, you know, one candidate wants to use immigration as a bludgeon against the other candidate, right? Now we have a lot of problems here at Human Rights First with the bipartisan immigration deal that was struck in February of this year. We're not going to get into the qualities of that. But what I will say is this invasion rhetoric was used to help sink that deal because one candidate, Trump, wanted to run on immigration to implement, frankly, much more draconian immigration measures should he get elected. So you know, we need to, I'm kind of reached the climax of what I'm saying, so I'll end shortly. But you know, when we talk about when we talk about invasions, we just need to keep in mind that this is humanitarian. So,
And, you know, Chris, just to jump in on that point, I mean, you know, experts, researchers have found that when those in power, particularly, right, but anyone uses dehumanizing language to describe another, that's a precursor to violence, to oppression, and at times to genocide, right? So this is alarming what's happening. It's not just, you know, like election year antics or something. I mean, when, you know, a candidate for our highest office, you know, in an interview with Time is invoking and saying that it's a military invasion, right? Our, you know, former commander-in-chief, potential future commander candidate, right, is saying this is a military invasion, what's happening at the border, and elected politicians are echoing this language. And there's this othering of people seeking asylum, you know, of humans, that they're not, you know, that they're animals, that you know, just this cruelty and dehumanization is extremely dangerous for, you know, our country and who we are as a people.
yeah, and it has real implications, right? Like you talked about othering. Was it last year, I believe, in El Paso? Migrants were killed at a bus stop because they were targeted by a white supremacist. The El Paso shooting in 2018, right? We see this play out over and over and over again. Even honestly, you know, this anti-migrant language shows up away from the border when the tragic bridge collapse in Baltimore, where I think it was 6 Venezuelan migrants were working on the bridge. They very tragically died in that bridge collapse, and the language on the right was just incredibly alarming and dehumanizing over that. So this is I think people, when they look at this webinar, we say, okay, veterans and democracy. That's what this whole series is about. Over the next, throughout the rest of this year, we want to do these webinars every month to talk about it. What does immigration have to do with democracy? Well, this is one of the big issues facing our democratic republic right now. And it's really important that the veteran community is informed, that the broader civil society is informed about the implications of where we're headed.
Yeah, just to add to that too, real quick, Chris, that I lost my thought. I was going to say that it's not just why veterans, right? And again, so like there's, because it matters and we can, but then there's also good practical reasons. One, it affects us. Like I said, myself, I'm an Afghan vet, so like there's a large population of people I care a lot about who are being directly impacted by these rules, by the the proposed changes to the CFR, to the Code of Federal Regulations. This whole thing that we're talking about, the asylum ban. Two, not just the Afghan folks. There's a large number. There's a population of veterans who served around the same time I did. When I was in boot camp, I was with a couple of folks who weren't U.S. citizens. They were foreign nationals, but who had green cards. I not them, but there's a large population of those folks who served in the US military with green cards who have since been deported, right? And who are trying to find, and so this also affects them. There's folks who, I have an uncle who does a lot of work in this, and he watched a documentary and he said, one of these vets who is now in Mexico was told like he can come back when he dies. He's allowed to be buried on US soil in a US military base, but he can't re-enter the country. I think he had attempted, and it was subject to one of the bars for attempting to enter without inspection at some point. But yeah, he can't come back to the United States until he's just a thing now. So this is affecting us. It's affecting people who served with us, who who fought and were injured alongside of us. It's happening to our brothers and sisters, both who served with us and who helped us out in Afghanistan. But also, why the veteran voice matters here. I feel like we're a people who are particularly well poised to counter invasion language. Like we know what invasions are. We know what invasions look like. And if someone needs to be a truth teller, if someone needs to say the emperor has no clothes, like why not veterans? If we have this coin, this societal thing, it's still a well-respected institution, and we still have this cash. Like what better place to use it on, and where your expertise and experience kind of matter, right? Like these are things that veterans can talk about and should be talking about, and should be standing up and saying, no, this isn't war. It's not what it is. I've seen war, and it's not, right. I've seen people in crisis before, in difficult situations, also in other countries, not the US. And this is what that looks like. Why veterans? Because we know these things, we know these traumas, we know these people, and we have a unique perspective on them. And I think we also have the space in the societal conversation, in the discourse, to say something. So I mean, yeah, you can't pick a better spot if you want to get involved and activate around something, I think, than some of these immigration issues. It's just particularly important for veterans to do. So I hope they do.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Pete. VFAI sent a group of veterans down to the border in 2020. I think I actually see one of the people who we sent down to the border on this call, to see and to say exactly that. You know invasions, this isn't an invasion. A war zone, this shouldn't be a war zone. So thanks for that insight, Pete. So we've been talking about kind of the ethical and the human harms of this type of rhetoric and to deterrence. But Christina, why don't deterrence policies work programmatically and policy-wise?
Yeah, thanks, Emily. So, we're at a time of really heightened global forced displacement. So, as Pete was mentioning earlier, these are people who aren't, choosing to leave their homes for better economic opportunities, although that is also, folks' right to migrate, but folks who are forced to leave their home. They're being displaced because of persecution or fear of persecution on account of these protected characteristics. They're protracted crises, as many of you know, conflicts displacing people. And so our southwest border is receiving higher numbers of people in need of protection. And yet policies like whether it's metering and putting caps on entry through safe access points like our official, ports of entry, or stranding people to remain in Mexico during the pendency of their asylum claims, or to try to contend with, a digital barrier, which is also being capped, right? This application, these policies, or at its worst, Title 42 expulsions, which, Chris was mentioning, this bipartisan bill that failed ultimately was foreseeing including a lot of these components back in and legislating and codifying them. So these deterrence policies that we've had in place for decades now, they don't work. They're counterproductive. They don't deter people from coming to seek safety. People who still see in our America our best ideals and values and think that they can find safety and protection here, right? And that they have a fair chance to seek asylum. These policies don't deter people from coming to seek protection, but what they do is punish them and harm them, and put their lives at risk, whether they're stranded and trapped in Mexico, whether they're returned to their countries of origin because of, orchestrated technicalities, right? So unable to meet certain exceptions, heightening the standard that they have to meet in these rushed fear screenings that take place, in ICE facilities and CBP facilities. So these are essentially, holding facilities or jails with limited access to counsel. Many people, the vast majority of them, don't have access to an attorney. to understand what is the definition of an asylum seeker and how can I best prepare my claim. So all of these measures only punish people and put them in harm's way. And, actually, as we speak, the administration has just released notice of a proposed rule providing the public a short window of 30 days to comment on measures that they are going to be implementing to make it even harder for people in search of asylum protection to receive it. And this will specifically impact, for example, those fleeing, protracted conflicts, right? Those who have been displaced, refugees, fleeing persecution, and even folks who have been our allies. Because what this rule is looking to do is in these rushed screenings, sometimes happening, within 24 hours or days of crossing the border, again, in custody, without access to an attorney the majority of the time, you're interviewed and you're held to this higher standard under the ban. But what this rule is looking to do is, and I haven't had a chance to read it thoroughly, but from what I gather, is implement some of the reasons why someone may not be eligible for asylum protection, which right now that's only done when someone has their full asylum interview before an asylum officer or before an immigration judge and has time to prepare their claim. They're going to be doing that at the fear screening stage. And so, for example, there are certain bars. So if someone's, persecuted others, of course, they do not merit asylum protection, right? But that's a really legally complex and factually complex analysis, right? If someone has provided, for example, material support to a non-state armed group or actor, often, folks under duress have different levels of contact with these with individuals in conflict zones. And so these are really assessments that require preparation and evidence to, ensure that we're not wrongfully denying someone protection summarily in a quick fear screening within days without access to counsel. And so that's what this rule, from what I'm gathering, again, I'll read it. It's been published just now, but that's what advocates and others are understanding that this will do. And these are measures that this does not deter folks from arriving, right? What does it do? It just increases the chances of wrongful return to persecution. And again, why? What's the impetus for this? And this goes back to what we're talking about of why immigration has, really been thrust to the forefront, and this dehumanization and this, invasion rhetoric and all of this surrounding context that is now, impacting children and families and adults who are seeking protection here.
Thanks, Christina. So yeah, I know we're nearing kind of the end, and so Brenda, I wanted to pass over to you to think through solutions. I think a lot of your work is meeting with members of Congress and trying to shift the narrative, and so I wanted to turn it over to you to kind of talk through what solutions you see to help with this.
Yeah, thank you so much, Emily, for the question. So in our advocacy with members of Congress and their staffers as well, we always try to raise real solutions that uphold our values as a nation to effectively and humanely welcome people with dignity and respect. And so one of those is, well, first and foremost, we need to end this harmful asylum ban. And I think advocates are in agreement with that. We need to restore access to asylum at our nation's border. And by doing this, we need to ensure that we efficiently and safely process people seeking safety with or without a CBP-1 appointment, so they aren't stranded for months in Mexico, where their lives are at risk. I mean, Christina and I mentioned a few examples of the trauma and all of the hardship that people have faced in Mexico. We also are calling to create a more effective and timely immigration system, one that it ensures that people have their asylum cases heard in a timely manner, and to reduce those backlogs. There's a need for immigration court staff officers to help push those cases along and adjudicate those cases, and access to counsel to help protect the due process rights of people seeking asylum. Kind of also ties in with, once folks are here, like ensuring people have access to work authorization applications. I know some border shelters to help people apply for those work permits. So that's something that is desk authorization. And one other thing that that Christina focused in her research in her report is that we also need the Department of State and the Biden admin officials to engage government in Mexico to address those restrictions at those port of entries for people seeking asylum. If these restrictionist policies, they're just going to continue to perpetuate that cycle of violence. If you keep having people, if you're forcing people to wait in Mexico for those limited appointments for the CBP-1 application. And that kind of ties in also with that. Just this week, we led a delegation of constituents who are dedicated to refugee protection and also welcoming folks with members of Congress and their staffers to share about their work and how they create that welcoming environment for refugees. And so during those conversations in those meetings, they were pushing for the Refugee Protection Act and the Afghan Adjustment Act. It's just essentially action faces these challenges at the border. It's just as crucial that we use our voices to oppose this asylum ban and ensure that we live up to our American.
Yeah, thanks, Brenda. You might be cutting out a little bit, but I think we got most of what you were saying, and I know that in our follow-up email we're going to have ways that people can get involved. So thank you so much for detailing all of the work that you do. You know, in our last question, I kind of wanted to pass it back over to Pete and to Chris. You know, why is it important that we're having this conversation?
So much,
right? Thanks, Brenda. Why is it important that we're having this conversation right now? Why is this a veteran issue, and why should veterans continue to care about this issue?
Go ahead, Chris.
Well, I think we hit it earlier, right? Like veterans know what a humanitarian response, well, veterans know what a military response is and why it's not effective, right? And we also know what our American ideals and values are. And we know that we all signed up to defend the Constitution and, you know, this idea of a pluralistic society. Maybe not everybody really understood that's what they were doing, but that's what we were doing, right? Like we all understood at the end of the day when we got out of uniform, we fought for a country that wanted to advance the rights of others. And what we're doing at the border is not that. And so I know that we are going to announce, well, we're announcing a little mini campaign that we're going to be sending out for folks to participate in, you know, to kind of record themselves and talk about this on social media. And we've got some talking points that we're gonna put out either tomorrow or at some point next week. So keep an eye out for that. But the veteran voice is really critical. Pete was absolutely right. You know, the American society, for whatever it's worth, has given us this cachet to use. We all appreciate our 10% off at Lowe's, and that's great, and I appreciate, and that's awesome, but we need to use that for something good. And so that's what we're asking to do. I saw in the chat, Tita, I think, was asking, are we going to go out there and promote this to other veterans? Well, that's who we are here at Vets for American Deals. That's what we do. We want to influence the veteran conversation on this and other issues. So Pete, I don't know if you got anything else to say.
You just, yeah, I feel like you nailed it, right? Just like I said earlier, this is happening to people we know. So I feel like it's personal. It's happening to Afghans. It's happening to service members. And it's happening to humans. But it should be personal for us as veterans. You know, you can't call it an invasion if I know somebody on the other side of that, right? That's just that knowledge and experience is kind of the most powerful anecdote for that kind of bias and that extremist language, right? Like, no, I know these people and that's not who they are, right? But why should we care and why is it important? It's personal. We know who it's happening to. We know this field. We know what, the use of violence against, vulnerable people versus other people and just the use of violence in general and what trauma looks like, right? So it's a personal issue for us. It's an arena that we're familiar with. And most of all, yeah, I think we have a moral obligation. Putting on the uniform means standing for America and what America is and what values it espouses is a battlefield. It's a competition. It's a marketplace of competing ideas. And I don't like what the other side is saying. And because I wore that uniform, I feel like I have a personal stake in that conversation. I think most veterans do. I think most Americans do. It's not just veterans, right? It's bankers and nurses and cooks and anybody, right? This is about who we are. So not saying that other folks don't, but I certainly feel like I have a stake in that conversation. And yeah, in the space to do it. So it's critical that vets speak out. And and the one thing is, I think there can be stereotypes about veterans and how they might feel on any certain political issue, right? And so, but we know that that's not true. We know that demographically, the military is not this thing that some people might think it is. People come from all over, and the political diversity and the ideological diversity in the military mirrors the public. We are kind of a microcosm of the larger America. But if veterans who believe as we believe and who stand for human rights don't speak out, we're ceding that ground and that conversation to other veterans who are also going to use their cachet for ways that I'm not comfortable with and that I disagree with. And I don't want that to happen. I don't want it to be that veterans are seen as an anti-immigrant group or a hateful group or a bigoted group or a conservative group, a group that's for retrenchment. No, I think veterans can be for human rights and for progressive values. And I don't want to give that away, and certainly not without a fight. So that's why VFAI exists, and that's why we do what we do.
And, if I could just jump in, I mean, that's exactly what this comes back to. There was a time, some of you may remember when, refugee protection was a bipartisan issue. Everyone got around upholding human rights, especially considering how inextricably linked it is to situations of conflict and persecution and violence and harm that drives many and authoritarian regimes and totalitarianism and just all kinds of crackdown on all human rights, right? On all aspects. And the convention grounds show that when you think, the freedom of religion, the freedom to express your political beliefs. I mean, this is the cornerstone of who we are as a people, of our, founding principles, right? In terms of upholding civil liberties and such. And so, really what we're seeing at our southwest border is it's a test in the sense of, history has its eyes on us. How do we, as the leader of the free world, right? How do we, as upholder of human rights abroad with other countries and other, really difficult situations, how do we treat those at our doorstep? Because, when Brenda and I are researching, we are literally at the doorstep. I can see US soil, and yet folks are blocked and banned and trapped in danger. And the trauma that children and teenagers and elderly and women and family and young adults and people of all ages and all colors and backgrounds who are escaping persecution, because I've interviewed them and I understand what motivated them to leave. So I can tell you, these are folks who are fleeing harm. Many of them, it's a result of these policies, and that's not who we are. And as the wealthiest country, and having worked abroad in other refugee contexts, we absolutely have the resources to humanely and safely welcome, to promptly process people, to maximize our, capacity at these safe ports of entry so that folks aren't putting their lives at risk and crossing through hazardous areas. Like, we could do that, but that's a choice. And so that's why your voice really matters. And so thank you so much again to my fellow panelists, but to all of you here today, and to this message, hopefully, that you'll take and share with others. And please count on us. And we appreciate you so much.
Such an important note to end on. Thank you so much, Christina, Brenda, Pete, and Chris, for having this conversation all together today. Yeah, like everybody mentioned, we have follow-up, we have next steps, we have some calls to action for you. So be on the lookout for an email from VFAI, and stay tuned for our next webinar series later in June, where again, we talk about issues that are important to veterans and upholding our democracy. So thank you everybody for attending. Thank you for the panelists for being here, and we'll see you on our next one. Thank you, everybody.